of the cerebrum. The boundaries of the temporal lobe are formed by the lateral sulcus and the preoccipital notch. This is the preoccipital notch located here. If we draw an imaginary line to the end of the lateral sulcus from the preoccipital notch, then it will form a good boundary to the temporal lobe. So these are the two boundaries, lateral sulcus or the sylvian fissure, we have already seen this, and this is the preoccipital notch. Now let us see the parts, different regions of the temporal lobe. The first is the primary auditory cortex, the second is the auditory association cortex, and the third is the Wernicke's areas. And we have also some deep medially located structures, which are the primary olfactory cortex and the association cortex of related to olfaction. And the last area which we have to see is the insular cortex, which can also be considered as a separate lobe in the skull. So let us see their functions in brief. The primary auditory cortex, as the name suggests, is responsible for conscious awareness of the sound. Auditory association cortex is responsible for taking the sensory information which is coming in the primary auditory cortex and manipulating its meaning, understanding of sound. Wernicke's areas, we have already talked about this in the first part of cerebrum, that it is responsible for comprehension and understanding of written or spoken language. Now let's see the brief function of the primary olfactory cortex and its association cortex. It is responsible for conscious awareness of smell, and the association cortex helps to analyze and recognize the smell. This is clear. Now let us talk about the insular cortex, which has three main functions. That is, it is responsible for gustatory sensations, visceral sensations, and vestibular sensations. This you have to remember, that has three basic functions of the insular cortex, which can also be considered as a separate fifth mini lobe of the brain. Now let us talk about them each of them in detail one by one. First of all, let us talk about the primary auditory cortex. It helps us to identify the frequency of sound, the pitch of the sound, the location of the sound, that is from where the sound is coming from. Now let us see the mechanism of how the sensory information is reached from the ears to the primary auditory cortex of the temporal lobe of the brain. So this is the eighth cranial nerve. Alright, this is the main pathway, that is here also we have the contralateral mechanism, that is from the left side of from the right ear the information passes towards the right side of the brain, and from the right ear it passes to the left side of the brain. Alright, so let us talk about if we have a lesion in any of the parts. Suppose we have a lesion in the right primary auditory cortex. This is the right primary auditory cortex, so we won't be able to hear the sound which is coming from the left ear. So loss of sound stimulus from the left side of the ear, alright, or the left ear. Now let us talk about the auditory association cortex. As I already told you that the sensory information which is coming in the primary auditory cortex is passed to the auditory association cortex for manipulation of its meaning or understanding of that sound. Alright. So let us talk about this. Based on pitch, frequency and amplitude, the sound is analyzed and compared with the past experiences, past memories, and then it is interpreted that what is the sound, like what the person is trying to say or from where the sound is coming. We can analyze all that, and we can also compare it with the past experiences. Now let us talk about Wernicke's areas. Wernicke's areas is located here at the boundary of the lateral sulcus or the sylvian fissure, and we have already talked about in the first part that the Wernicke's area also connects with the Broca's area. I will see this now. Wernicke's area connects with the Broca's area through the arcuate fasciculus. We have already seen this in the first part. Now let us see the mechanism. We have sound stimulus coming from the auditory cortex, visual stimulus coming to the visual cortex. The visual stimulus goes to the visual cortex of the brain. Sound stimulus goes to the auditory cortex of the brain. All these stimuluses come together in the association cortex, and from the association cortex it is passed on to the Wernicke's areas. And combined stimuluses of the sound and the visually impulses from the Wernicke's areas pass to the Broca's area so that we can react. We have already seen that the Broca's areas is responsible for producing speech. So Wernicke's areas coordinates with the Broca's areas in producing that speech through the arcuate fasciculus. So Wernicke's areas passes the information to the Broca's areas what we have to say, and the Broca's areas controls the muscles of the mouth. We have already seen in the first part, and thus in this way the speech is produced. So that's why we say that the function of the Wernicke's areas is, we have written in the first slide that the function of the Wernicke's areas is comprehension and understanding written or spoken language. So all right, now let us move on to the next part, and that is the Wernicke's aphasia. This is the disease just similar to we have seen Broca's aphasia. So this is a little bit of opposite to that. Like in Broca's aphasia, we do not have fluent speech, but the patient says sensical things. But in Wernicke's aphasia, since he is not able to interpret the information, the speech which he is giving out is fluent, but it is nonsensical. Comprehension is not intact, and he or she also shows repetitive aphasia. All right. Now let us talk about the primary olfactory cortex and its association cortex. The primary olfactory cortex is located deep medially inside the brain. We have already talked about this. Now let us see the mechanism. Suppose this is a smell. The smell is first passing to the from the nose to the olfactory bulb located inside the brain. From the olfactory bulb, it is passed to the olfactory trunk, and which divides into the medial olfactory striae and the lateral olfactory striae. From the lateral olfactory striae, it passes to the primary olfactory cortex. So this, as we can see here, this is the primary olfactory cortex. From the primary olfactory cortex, the sensory information is passed to the olfactory association cortex. The association cortex stores that sense into the memory, also helps in recognizing. All right. So we just there is also this also the similar mechanism that the association cortex compares it with the previous experiences and the previous memories which are already stored in the brain, and helps in analyzing that what kind of smell it is. So now let us talk about the mini lobe of the brain, that is the insular cortex. It can be categorized as a separate lobe in the brain. I already told you, it receives visceral sensations. It also receives sensation from the equilibrium from the vestibular apparatus, and it receives the gustatory sensations via the nucleus of tractor solitaris. So this is the name through which the gustatory, this is the nucleus in the present in the brain through which the gustatory sensations pass to the insular cortex. So the three main functions, it has three main functions. We have to remember only these three functions, that it receives the visceral sensations, it also receives the sensations of equilibrium from the vestibular apparatus, and the third is the gustatory sensations. Thank you.